Okay, welcome back. This will be the last of our videos on Karl Marx's Das Kapital. In this series of videos, we've been hitting upon some of the highlights of the economic theory presented in Karl Marx's Das Kapital. In this final video, we will be reviewing just brief parts of what we learned in videos 1 through 4. We'll be discussing business cycles and employment in Das Kapital, as well as the ensuing social conflict, as well as general social conflict as an issue in Das Kapital. And then finally, we'll be discussing some unexplained issues and summarizing sort of the takeaways from Marx's Das Kapital video. This is not meant as a definitive presentation of Marx's work. What we're trying to do here is to merely present some of the highlights of the economic aspects of Das Kapital. Das Kapital has influenced fields as wide as, of course, economics, sociology, anthropology, history, psychology, and others. I'm an economist. We are not here to talk about the sociology really of Marx or the anthropology, any of these things. Okay, we're really here to talk about the economics. In this final video, though, we will approach some of those other fields. Approach, but not get to. Okay, so let's review. In the first video, we saw that observed economic activity, of course, occurs in markets, and that individuals exchange commodities, right? So that we observe commodities exchanging hands for money prices. However, those money prices do not reflect true economic relationships in Marx's explanation. Okay. Indeed, the process of commodity exchange masks the underlying social conditions. So true economic relationships are expressed in terms of labor inputs or in terms of socially necessary labor employed. And so then Das Kapital is an exercise in identifying the problems associated with this misunderstanding of economic relationships, as well as to uncover the underlying social relationships that represent the true organization of the economy. Owners of capital in Marx's structure are able to extract surplus value from labor. So although Marx's model is a competitive model, unlike orthodox economics where competitive labor markets ensure that labor is paid the market value of its marginal input, in the Marxian structure, labor is not paid the full market value of its marginal input. It is paid something less than that. And the difference between the two is the value expropriated by owners of capital is referred to as surplus value. We also saw in earlier videos, we developed Marx's sort of basic economic model, and then we saw how we can transform these labor input values into market values. This is known as the transformation problem. And in that model, we saw the beginnings of how over time, if we were to run the model repeatedly, over time, economic growth will slow, the rate of profit will decline, working conditions will become ever more hurried and antagonistic, and eventually this will become so serious that capitalism itself will collapse. Important thing to understand in Marx, there's nothing in Das Kapital that advocates revolution or anything like that. Marx's other works, different story, right? But we're here to talk about Das Kapital. In Das Kapital, the movement from capitalist organization of the economy to socialistic organization of the economy and eventual communistic organization of the economy is as certain as the sun coming up tomorrow morning. It's something that will simply happen due to the organization of society. To understand this, it's worth spending a moment, which we didn't do in the last one, to talk about business cycles, that is the periodic ups and downs of the economy and employment in sort of Marx's structure. As we laid out earlier, Marx did not adhere to the iron law of wages, or the subsistence theory of wages, that other classical economists did adhere to. So, for example, in David Ricardo, what keeps wages down? As soon as there's a little bit of extra, income for households, they enjoy a higher standard of living for a brief period of time, but then, of course, have more kids, and that brings wages back down by raising the supply of labor. Marx didn't see it this way at all. So Marx's explanation here is different from other classical economists. In Marx, the price of labor power is regulated by what he referred to as the reserve army of the unemployed, that is, by unemployment. So the price of labor is brought down by the threat of unemployment and by unemployed workers. Unemployment should be unemployment there in the slide. Unemployment persists because of constant structural dislocation. So the constant movement, the dynamicism of the economy ensures that there's always structural dislocation and that the existing stock of operating capital is insufficient to maintain full employment. Okay, so Marxian unemployment, the reserve army of the unemployed, doesn't exist for Keynesian reasons. Okay, in modern macroeconomics, Keynesian macroeconomics, unemployment exists due to a lack of aggregate demand. So if you crank up demand, unemployment will go away. Now, in Marx, unemployment exists for a different reason. It's not due to lack of aggregate demand. It's due to insufficient operating capital stock. In short, there just aren't ever enough jobs to go around given the capital for labor to work with. Okay, and this is to some extent by design, because if unemployment goes down to a sufficiently low number that wages begin to rise, then those rising wages cut into profits a la Ricardo, and investment falls. That is, the stock of new capital being developed falls, okay, leading to, again, you got it, increased unemployment. So, and any tendency towards rising wages, towards full employment will result in economic slowdown, resulting in more unemployment. So there is very much in Marx a sort of equilibrium level of unemployment, but for different reasons than in Keynes. In all corners of Marx, so everywhere, we look in Marx's work, what we see is conflict, particularly conflict over scarce economic resources. So we have, this is a bit of a stretch. Some people are going to call me out on this, but it's a bit of a Hobbesian sort of world, a struggle of all against all, right? It's a world where we're all scrambling to get on top of the economic pile, pushing down others as we move upwards. There's conflict over capital. There's conflict between labor for employment. So labor's fighting with other laborers for existing employment. Conflict between small and large owners of capital as large owners of capital extract surplus value from small owners of capital, and then, of course, earn higher profits. Conflict between owners of capital in general, the bourgeoisie, and labor, the proletariat. So in all corners of society, we have conflict between different groups. And of course, Marx is the beginning of so-called conflict theory, which is commonly used in sociology and some other fields, is even within the capitalist system. So the very idea of capitalism contains a variety of conflicts. So the institutional structure of society is such that it is conflicted. Examples. Okay, and this isn't a complete examples of all the internal conflicts presented in Marx, but these are the ones that we can deduce most directly from the model that we've already laid out. Increasing immiseration of labor brings recognition of social interdependence. Right? So even as capitalism makes working conditions worse and worse and worse, right? There's this internal conflict that people start to recognize their interdependence. Okay. Financial capital accumulation becomes more important than real economic processes. So commodification of labor. The of course, the point of an economy, as illustrated most clearly by Adam Smith, is to raise real standard of living, right? Real quality of life. Marx makes the argument that what capitalism does is turns this idea around and instead makes the economy about accumulating nominal resources, a la mercantilists, where we started this course. And that we see the economy in those terms, right? So we start to see ourselves, everything else, as commodities to be bought and sold. So we lose sight of what an economy is really about because of the way exchange occurs in capitalist processes. Okay. Third, the process of seeking profits, the quest for surplus value, ends up reducing the pool from which profits are drawn, right? So this is sort of the most internal thing that ends up causing capitalism to collapse, is that as technology becomes more and more prevalent in production, because individual firms are trying to maximize profits, that ends up reducing the pool of surplus value that firms are able to draw from, because you can't exploit the machinery, you can only exploit the labor. And as a consequence, the struggle for that pool becomes ever more intense. Okay, so that's sort of the story that where we are at this point. So, what are the problems so far? I mean, it's a pretty convincing story, and we can see that, that there's a lot of things in Marx's story that would, I think, would ring true to the average person, right? But there are some real issues here. Most notably, the transformation problem. So the solution of transforming labor inputs into market prices is a weak solution. As we saw in the third video, it requires extremely strong assumptions to arrive at that solution. Most notably, the equalization of the rate of surplus value across all labor. The idea that all workers are exploited at essentially the exact same rate. It's a strong assumption. And of course, as we all know as economists, strong assumptions make for relatively weak models. And so without that, right, so some commentators and Marx will say, well, yeah, that's right, but it's really not that big of a deal. Well, I guess it depends where you want to take that, whether it's a big deal. But without that, it's difficult to prove exploitation. Right? You might say, well, it's obvious that exploitation exists, and some, okay, well, fine. How much, right? Because without a metric of exploitation, it's really difficult to arrive at a policy solution. So, for example, if we were to use modern microeconomic tools and we were able to show that a competitive market would produce prices of X, and that the existing markets is producing prices of 10% below X, right? Then we have a metric for compensating labor, right? So, for example, in a like a sexual discrimination lawsuit, you might say, well, okay, well, we can show that male workers are paid X, right, and female workers with the same job description and everything, controlling for other variables, are paid X, minus 10% or something like that. Well, now we have the basis for compensation. Now we have a basis for understanding what's going on here, what the exploitation is. And without that metric, right, it becomes very difficult to really do much besides say there's a problem. Okay. The second, so that's a serious issue, right? Second issue, of course, Marx predicts that working conditions should get ever more worse. Well, have working conditions really gotten worse since Marx's time? If we look in the aggregate, right, if we look at world data, then it's really hard to say that, because a smaller share of the world's population lives in poverty today than in Marx's time or in any other time in history. So the world population is better off today than it ever has been. Now, certainly if we look within certain aspects of the economy, so if we look at like job X or job Y within, say, the United States or Great Britain, for sure we're going to find businesses and industries where things have gotten a lot worse in recent years, right? We may even look at whole national economies and notice that things have gotten worse than they were years ago. But in the aggregate, it's not so. So again, it's one of those things where, we can, like with the previous one, right? That there are some places where it seems to sort of jibe, and others where it doesn't, right? And so we really lack specifics. Okay. Finally, falling rates of profits and increasing misery will bring about the end of capitalism. Okay. Well, profits in general, we can look at the data, haven't fallen. Furthermore, a greater share of the global economy is capitalistic today than at any other time in history. Capitalism is spreading. And here we're defining capitalism essentially in the same way that I'm defining capitalism, the same way that Marx did. That is to say, an economy directed by private ownership of the means of production. Okay, that is more commonplace today than it has been at any other time in history. So it's hard to say that that's really happened. So these are some serious issues. So if we acknowledge these and then recognize still though that Marx has had this huge influence on society, right? People watching this will be more familiar with the name Karl Marx than any other authors that we've discussed in here, perhaps even more than Adam Smith. Karl Marx's writings have had a tremendous influence on world history since his time over the last 150 years. So there has to be sort of something here. So if we get past all of this, what sort of remains? Well, as I mentioned in the first video, Karl Marx's work represents the final culmination of classic economic thought. So the structures of thinking about an economy that really started with Adam Smith, really, and David Ricardo really wrap up with Karl Marx. It's by far the most sophisticated presentation of classical economic thought. That said, the structure of classical economic thought probably wasn't sufficient to explain what Marx is trying to explain. In other words, he's trying to take a very basic explanation of how economy functions and operates and to stretch it into a explaining this sort of grand narrative of how history and societies develop. And that probably was a stretch, my opinion. Okay. And so if we dismiss a lot of the classical economics, if we attempt to take what remains of Marx beyond the sort of crude classical economics and consider it in its own light, what are we kind of left with? Well, we're left with an explanation of history that's wholly material. So in Marx, history occurs for material reasons. Material being, the physical stuff around us. A sort of we are what we do explanation of history. Second, we have a way of thinking about social conflict, right? So Marx gives us the beginnings of at least one way of thinking about how societies are internally conflicted and how those internal conflicts impact the distribution of material output in those societies. Okay. And finally, it gives us a structure for thinking about economic relationships, right? So if we look at, if we read Marx and we understand what he's talking about, then it does give us some real tools for thinking about how society evolves, how economies evolve over time. That certainly have some merit, but they're really not specific enough to give us any real policy recommendations. In other words, okay, so we clearly have exploitation here. What do we do about it? How do we fix it? What policy will mitigate this? Okay, hi everybody. So as I'm editing this video, something occurred to me that I forgot to say here that is really important, and I don't want to leave you without having said that. So one of the takeaways we should get from reading Marx and working through Marx's work is really the importance of being very clear in our economic modeling and expressing what we believe to be the relationship between variables. As we've seen earlier in this slide, a lot of Marx's relationships, upon scrutiny, break down, or at least become the lack of specifics where there's anything really we can do anything about it. And that's not really doing science anymore, right? If we lay out what we think and then we test how we think these variables relate to each other, and then we find errors, but then we're able to develop newer and better models that prove to be more accurate. Well, then we're making real progress, and we're constructing something that we can use to actively improve the state of economic affairs. Whereas when we fail to do that, we potentially open the doors to a lot of problems. Now, it's not to say that non-scientific endeavors are not worth doing. They most certainly are doing. Hell, these guitars and other stuff I've got laying around here, right? It's nothing to do with science. Okay, it's worth doing, right? But as economists, it's not necessarily what we're trying to do, right? And so we need to be careful to separate sort of the philosophy of economics, the philosophy of thinking about an economy, and constructing a theory of economy that is actionable. They should be sort of two different things. All right. Anyway, I'll leave it there, and back to the regular video. There's not much there to tell us what sort of to do, sort of actionable recommendations, if you will. Okay, but maybe that's asking too much. Okay, so I've said my piece on this. I'll not say any more. Have a good day, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed this series. I've enjoyed making it, and take care. Bye.